So, friends, we have a great show for you today. Scott's going to give us a little history on the Wright brothers and how it intersects with the Apollo program. So, take it away, Scott.
Well, yes, you realize that these beautiful stories that happen in history, we're going to compare the Apollo program with the Wright brothers because those are first in history. So you have these two guys, Wilbur and Orville Wright there, and they're sitting there with their little bicycle shop. And of course, back in those days, there's no phones, there's no nothing. So they're sitting out on the porch having their lunch and they're whittling away on a piece of wood, to keep themselves busy. So Wilbur, he just pokes a hole in the middle of his wood and he's carving it away. And when they go back in for lunch, he just hangs it up on a nail. Well, eventually, when he comes out, he sees the thing damn well spinning around and he goes, Jesus, that's great. And of course, they're in the middle of this competition. I mean, everybody and their brother out building bicycles. They don't have the technology or anything else because, you got this Henderson guy down the street and he's putting engines in his bicycles. And then you got, Harley and Davidson. They're working on their bikes and they're putting engines in their bikes. Okay. And they don't have a budget. So, they're just building bicycles. That's all they're doing. So anyway, he's got this piece of wood, and when you hold it up to the wind, it spins, and he decides he's going to go down and see Harley and Davidson over there and see if he can borrow an engine, because they're going to power the thing up. So they build this, not a bicycle, but a tricycle, and they mount this engine on it. And they're driving around, and they got the propeller, and it's spinning, and it's driving forward. And of course, everybody's dreaming of flight and stuff like that. So they start adding on to this tricycle shaped design and got their engine there and they got these wings designed out there. They finally make the thing fly, the first ones to make it fly. Now they're at the head of the pack. But in history, if you build a machine, somebody is going to challenge you. Like when they built the car, when they built the second car, they're going to race it. So you have a guy like Howard Hughes or whatever comes along and he's going to put up, a whole dollar or something in the challenge. The challenge is, just like Apollo, they're going to do something fantastic with this plane that they've developed. So the challenge is to fly around the world non-stop in 24 hours. So the Wright brothers build their plane, put a large enough fuel tank in it so it'll run for 24 hours. But they got, a 12 horsepower engine in this thing. And they're going to fly this thing for 24 hours. So they put a big press kit out to the media, just like Apollo did. This is the challenge, and this is the prize, and this is everything else. All the media come down to a grass field, and they take off to the east, and 24 hours later, here they come in flying from the west, land on the strip there, and guess what? They got maybe 30 seconds of fuel left. Isn't that a beautiful story? And the press picks it up and it's in all the papers and everything else. And it's just this big media event. And if you realize, at that timeline, people, they might have been maybe 5 or 10 miles away from their birthplace. That's about as far as they could travel. And if you told them they're flying around the world, they had no idea how big the world was. They had no idea that you could fly around the world in 24 hours. Because this plane would have to travel, at 1,000 miles an hour. And of course, if somebody came up to them and said, oh, hey, that plane had to go 1,000 miles an hour. Nobody knew how fast that was. If the plane is flying 50, nobody knew what 1,000 miles an hour was really like. But, they have to update their PDF files. Mind you, have to wait 100 years to get your PDF file from them. But when they're updating the thing, they just went, well, we simply flew up high enough and we just let the Earth rotate around us and we landed back down again. Simple solution, right? Sounds fantastic? They witnessed it, they saw them take off, and they saw them land, and they won the prize. Just another beautiful story, right? Just like Apollo. You see them take off, and you see them land. No different than the Wright brothers. Just another beautiful story.
Shorten that to BS.
Yes, that is the beautiful story, the BS. I like the 30 seconds of fuel.
Of course. You've got to have a bit of jeopardy in there somewhere. Yeah, it
What we
is.
really, really need to do is we need to talk about the opportunity that we have here to discuss Charles Duke, because being interviewed with Danny Jones there, we got to see him, and he was given enough opportunity to be able to speak frankly about the events that they claimed happened. I wouldn't have sat there, because if you were going to sit down in front of him like that, Charles Duke already knows that you don't believe he landed on the moon. So you don't really need to push that in. But here's the opportunity that was available. Charles Duke was involved in the program basically from scratch. He was part of the Apollo 11 and everything else in Capcom and stuff like that. However, all of the training that they did, and they actually did that. We know that he did that. So he'd be much more relaxed if you were asking him questions about, oh, gee, were you on those expeditions to gather the geological rocks all over the world? And what did you bring back? And then you could say, well, when you were in training, practicing at
Yeah.
Flagstaff, because we know you're at Flagstaff because that's documented. And we know the number of hours you spent there. You spent 16 months, sequestered in the training of Apollo 16. And that's documented. But at the same time, you could ask him about the rover that they were using at Flagstaff, because 4 electric motors, quarter horse apiece, is not going to drive that vehicle around at Flagstaff. Even if they did that, the batteries wouldn't last very long. You realize that by the time you put the rover, the batteries, the equipment on it, and 2 astronauts, if they had their suits on, if they're full dress, and if those suits weighed 180 pounds, you have about 1,400 pounds of vehicle there with only 1 horsepower. It's not going to drive it. And I would be asking them how many rovers they used, how long did it take, were they recharging the batteries, were they doing this, were they doing that. I'd be asking them how many magazines they were using in the cameras, what kind of photographs were they taking, and where are those photographs today? Where are all the geological rocks that they gathered from all their expeditions? Where are those? And were they using those rocks at the different stations that they set up? Because when you hear him talk, and he'll say, oh yeah, we pulled up to a station, we jumped off the thing, and we had to go get these rocks. That sounds like they were practicing. He's talking about being on the moon. But the information you can get, because then I would ask him about the suit that they were wearing, because they're not going to be wearing a 180-pound suit practicing in full simulation on the Earth when they're practicing. And I would ask him what the different modifications were for those suits, the different PLSSs that were on their back, because he just calls them a backpack. I'd say, actually, what's in there? Because what practically needs to be in there for them to be in that suit is just a battery to run the communications, and they just need a fan to blow air through that suit.
We can see that in the training videos, because
Yeah.
in the training videos, they don't even have a fan in the suits. He has a portable air conditioning unit, so that's what they're using.
When they were on their own in full simulation, they must have had something like that in that backpack instead. And then where are those suits and where are those backpacks that they did for training? And of course, they had multiple rovers out there. Some of the ones that you see the photographs when they're around the Grand Canyon, they had rubber tires on them. Those machines did not fold up. Those frames, you can actually see the frames. There's no hinges, there's no nothing on them. They don't fold up. And quite possibly, they're going to need a gas engine to run that, to drive the size of those tires and everything else. Little battery ones aren't going to work with that. And then where are those training rovers?
I would have liked to ask Charlie Duke 3 questions myself. I would have liked to ask him, how did you use polarized filters when you had no viewfinder in the cameras? Because you can't see what you're doing. And then number 2, I'd like to ask him why astrorad radiation vests are required now when you did not require them back in the 60s, when you went supposedly to the moon. And the third question I'd like to ask him is, what do you think about what Bart just showed you about them faking the Earth out the window when the camera was at the back of the window, and you just said that the way you would have taken it was to put the camera up to the window when these guys had it in the back? Did you see the look on Charlie Duke's face when Bart showed him that piece of
Yeah.
footage?
There was 4 seconds, and then somebody on the radio saying, talk to Neil, instructing Neil to respond to Houston after 4 seconds. Why do you think that would be?
I don't know.
Okay.
I've in my recollection, I was in mission control for Apollo 10.
Mm-hmm.
I was Capcom. I was in mission control for Apollo 11.
Mm-hmm.
It's Capcom. And nothing like this ever happened in mission control.
No, there would never be anybody saying talk to anybody.
No.
It would just be as soon as you hear it, you would respond.
Generally, that was true.
It was interesting that a lot of the comments under that, the main film, the original 3.5 hour film, this was elder abuse. All right, he's an old man, rather like me. He sat there and he was prepared to be questioned. That's not elder abuse. That is interviewing technique. There's no problem with his age. He was quite lucid. He was quite able to answer all the questions he was asked, but he wasn't asked the right questions, the correct questions.
But he agreed to go on there.
When Bart was saying, well, you remember the phone call that we had? You seem to remember that when we came to the studio, but now you're forgetting it's a great performance. But what Charlie Duke was doing was he was just egging Bart on.
It's a bit sad because it could have been quite revealing if the right questions were asked. Unfortunately, Danny Jones probably wasn't briefed sufficiently to be able to go to the hard questions.
Well, like I said, if you take and we know what he did in practice, he would be much more relaxed to answer those questions. And you'd be able to see the difference. Those are real memories. They're not fantasies.
What you do is use a little bit of psychology on Charlie and get him to reveal everything that he knows without him really knowing that he said it.
Yeah.
That's right. Because if he's going to describe the practice situations to us, we'll be able to then look at the photographs and things like that and see those items in there.
Yeah.
Like if he said the suit was modified for practice to this, then where's the real suit? Because the one he's going to be describing is the one he was wearing, and that's the one you see in the museum. And that suit doesn't function.
But Charlie was very adamant that he had been to the moon. He had been through the Van Allen belts. He had been right through everything. But it seemed that he didn't realize that he was in those belts for 1 hour and 30 minutes.
Each way.
Each way. And then what happens is that when you're going out, he was saying 25,000 miles an hour, then you slow down. Okay, that's fine. So now you're going out, whizzing through the belts at 25,000 miles an hour, let's say, and it's taking you an hour and a half. Okay, that's fine. Now you're coming back to the Earth, you have to slow down. So what speed are you now going through the Van Allen belts at when you're coming back? Because I guarantee you it will not be 25,000 miles an hour. You have to start slowing down. So that means that they're going to be in the belts even longer than an hour and a half.
Or they're going to be subjected to high G forces to slow down.
I remember Charlie saying, well, we took the rocket and we turned it around the opposite way and fired the engine towards the moon, and that's how we slowed down.
Also ask him about the skip re-entry proposal, because they didn't do a skip re-entry. Let's come in, bounce off the atmosphere and come in more slowly. They didn't do that. They came straight in, 25,000 miles an hour, into the atmosphere. Did the heat shield stand up to it? It didn't on the SLS-1. It was a missed opportunity, that one.
Yeah, he'd be more relaxed, though, if you were sitting there asking about stuff that they did to prepare for everything.
That's all it needs.
Because that stuff we know he did. And you could find out about all of the stuff that they were using, practicing with, where they're located while they're practicing. All of that stuff was there. How much time did you have with the camera? Like, he actually made a comment in there that the fact that, you know, could you see the Earth? And he said, no, the Earth was directly above us. And even if you tilted your head back, the helmet's in the way, you can't see it. He did that in the interview, right? He said, you can't see the Earth. And he said, you'd fall over backwards if you tried to lean back that far.
As a matter of fact, can I just make a point there? Speaking about leaning backwards, just for the fun of it, I put an Apollo image into the editor, and all I asked the editor was, make the astronaut take a picture of the Earth. And he goes up and up and up like this, and then all of a sudden he bends back so far that he falls over. I didn't tell it to do that. So
Right.
it obviously knew what was going to happen when he bent back too far.
And that happened on Apollo 11 as well, with that famous picture of the lander and the Earth above it. It's 60 degrees above the horizon.
But then you get
Yeah.
people like Brian Pop Robson come along and they'll say, well, he didn't have it mounted to his chest. He took it off his chest and pointed it up there.
How did
Right.
he know he got the Earth in the camera? He hadn't got a viewfinder.
No.
Yeah, they always forget these little details.
Yeah, you have every one of the Earth shots from the so-called surface of the moon are almost impossible to take. You have Apollo 12 where they're shooting directly over top of the LEM, and of course it looks so freaking tiny, the little half moon there.
This was another good point that I liked was that when Bart pulled up that image of the shadow of the rock going to the left and the image of the astronaut shadow going straight out, it was very strange how Danny was gaslighting everybody, trying to say that no, 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 that would have kept on going had the perspective been from the top side. And then remember, he compared with another camera when they put the two together. And yet you
Yeah.
look at the one that he was showing, and yes, they would have converged, but on that stand that he showed, the shadow was going straight out along with the shadow of the person. It wasn't going sideways. And yet
Yeah.
he was just adamant that that shadow was not going sideways. It was going straight. We're talking about the rock. I mean, you've got to be kidding me. Everybody can see that that shadow was sideways.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and how can that be? That's impossible. The one thing though that like when you read through the Finney file and stuff like that, they give detail in there on the amount of equipment that was available to them while they were practicing, while they were doing full simulations, which means that they had at least 2 rovers with them. They had extra cameras, extra magazines, extra batteries on board, extra PLSSs. And that's why I'm curious as to what is in the PLSS that they were using in simulation that they needed to have extra ones to replace them with. Was it just because the batteries were packed in there so tight or whatever, right? Those are the kind of questions I would be asking somebody there because they did do the practice. We know that. And he'd be very relaxed in being able to describe what all of the details that they did while they were practicing. Like, and how many people did it take to get that suit on while you were practicing? Sounds rather impossible to do it by yourself, doesn't it? But like I said, when you could ask somebody, I mean, it's a long time ago for him. You have to account for the fact that he is a very senior citizen. But his recall, like if you spend 16 months specifically training for Apollo 16 on there, and the number of times you're out at Flagstaff practicing those things, they had to set up the stations out there. They had to create the cue cards while they were out there. All of those things you could get that information from because they actually did it. And like, how many times did you redo those things? And you had Farouk Albrez out there. He's your timeline specialist out there. And you're timing how long it takes the rover to drive from one station to another that you set up and stuff like that. Get all those details, and he'd be very interested in telling you all those things because he experienced that.
Well, he was the one that drove the rover on the supposed lunar surface. So he would know exactly how long those batteries would have lasted.
Yeah, but if he's
And Bill-
on Earth, how much more power did you actually have to have in that vehicle to run it like that? Because
Yeah.
1 horsepower is not going to run. 4 quarter horsepower electric engines on there are not going to run that thing when it's going to on Earth.
Another thing I noticed with Charlie was that he never answered Bart's question about the scuba tanks because Bart said that when he took scuba diving lessons, he said that it took 2 oxygen tanks to stay down for 40 minutes. And yet, you had this tiny little oxygen cylinder that was like this, tiny little bottle, and you stayed out there for 8 hours. How is that possible? That was a very good question, and yet it was never answered.
I've looked into that because when you're talking about scuba tanks, you're just doing compressed air. If you have 80% oxygen in the suit. You've got a bottle that's got 100% oxygen compressed going into those suits. Even that small bottle should give them 2.5 to 3 hours.
They put 8?
Because you're mixing it in the suit. Don't forget the PLS has a CO2 scrubber.
Let's say that suit had a dragger in it, which is a rebreather. So let's just say it had one in there. How long do you think that oxygen bottle would have worked? Do you think it would have supplied enough for 8 hours?
2.5 to 3 hours, because you're adding pure oxygen to the air in the suit. You've got a scrubber taking the CO2 out.
There was another question that was in the comment section. One fellow was saying that because they were talking about the cooling of the suit and how that functions and the sublimator. And one fellow said, well, how come we can't see the vapor being sprayed out of that valve on the front of the suit? We never do.
No, you don't see that type of stuff. That's an unusual type of way to cool anyway, because you're allowing the water to absorb the heat and then kicking it out.
We would have seen vapor or water or something coming out of one of those valves once in a while. You would have seen that. And yet we can sit and watch the Apollo 17 all the way through, all of the EVAs put together, and yet we don't see it once.
No, you don't see any of that. But as far as the suit goes, you're adding oxygen because the body is consuming the oxygen. So there are documents, there's PDF files out there on how much your oxygen is needed. Never mind the amount of air. It's just the oxygen that the body provides. And it's quite a wide range depending on how active you are. And when we see how active the astronauts are in those suits running around, they're burning a lot of oxygen.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
If you were just sitting still, you could extend more than double the amount of time that oxygen that they have will provide. But when they're up and running around and doing that and hopping and all kinds of stuff, they're just burning that up like crazy.
How many EVAs were done on Apollo 16 Young would have been involved with?
3. Up to 3. Most of them are 7 to 8 hours.
Okay. So did they change the tanks in between EVAs?
When we looked at that, they said that they did pressurize the tanks back up using the LEM, that there was a system in the LEM that they could hook up to the tanks to fill them back with oxygen again.
Right, except that you won't find it in the transcript where they're talking about it. They're talking to Houston because they'd be confirming those numbers and confirming the fact that the system is now sealed off again back in the PLSS. The fact that they needed to change the battery out as well. The fact that they needed to change the CO2 scrubber out as well on the PLSS, as well as refill the water. All of that had to be done. That's going to take time. And they're going to be talking to Houston about it. You won't find that in the transcript at all.
No, but here's another thing that I would have asked Charlie as well. When you're on the lunar surface and you're getting back in and you're saying that you threw the PLSSs out because they're finished with, they're expired, we don't need the dead weight. So you throw them out the door. Now, what if something happened inside of that craft? For example, let's take a look at Apollo 13. What would have happened if they would have discarded that LEM? There would have been the end of them. They would have had no lifeboat. And yet here these guys are discarding a perfectly good PLSS unit that could save their lives if something went wrong and the oxygen supply just happened to vent out into space like it did when they had an explosion on Apollo 13 in the CSM module. You know, if that would have happened in the LEM, they would have been dead. However, if they would have had those PLSS packs, they would have been able to at least survive long enough to get back home. Seriously, that's what I would have asked him. That was another question I would have had for him.
Yeah. Here's the other thing that he said in that discussion. He said they got back in the LEM, then they depressurized it to throw out the PLSSs.
Right.
How freaking wasteful is that? Do they have the extra charge to repressurize that thing another time? That doesn't make sense. Don't forget they've got the buddy pack on the OPS pack where they can hook into the umbilical inside the craft. So they could have gone in there, not repressurized it, just left the door open, got rid of the PLSS packs, thrown them out, and hooked themselves onto an umbilical inside the craft before they repressurized it.
But throwing the buddy packs out, there is a waste of oxygen right there. That oxygen is only used in an emergency.
In an emergency, they should have kept the OPS.
Precisely.
But the other part of it is all of these batteries that they had. Apollo 11 needed 3 batteries just to stay for 24 hours. So they're there for 3 days. They've got all these used batteries. They're non-rechargeable batteries that are on that machine. They each weigh 140 pounds apiece. Why wouldn't they be throwing those off to save weight? Right? Like, instead of throwing the camera out that weighs a couple of pounds, why not throw a 140-pound out?
But again, if you're really on the lunar surface, you are going to be worried about your well-being. And I'm telling you, you are not going to throw spare oxygen out that door in case something happens. It's not going to happen, my friend. Your life is in danger the whole time you're there. And you're telling me that they're going to not only throw the PLS unit out, but they're also going to throw the buddy pack that has full container of oxygen in it out the airlock. Are you kidding me?
They're throwing the baby out with the bath.
Yeah. That doesn't happen in the real world. I'm sorry.
Did Charlie Duke have the cuff checklist? And if he did, was it showing something that he would have been able to see, but was put there before he left Earth? So how did they know what he was supposed to be seeing?
Charlie Duke donated his EVA-1 cuff checklist to the South Carolina State Museum in Columbia. Now, it says here, yes, astronaut Charlie Duke had a cuff checklist that he wore on his wrist during his moonwalks.
And so was it directing him to items that he wouldn't have been able to see prior to getting there?
Duke used one checklist for the first EVA, EVA-1, and a different one covering the procedures for the second and third EVAs, EVA-2 and 3. The pages included instructions for tasks like setting up the lunar rover vehicle, deploying scientific equipment, collecting samples, and even a sketch for the Grand Prix high-speed rover test. The backup crew even inserted a prank drawing into one of the blank pages.
It's the things that he was supposed to be looking for that he wouldn't have known were there until he saw them himself, which indicates that the cuff checklists were written before they left Earth. So how did anybody know what was supposed to be there? How did they know where they landed?
Well, that's another big problem because they had alternate landing sites. So what happened if something happened and they couldn't land there? Well, those cuff checklists have just gone right out the window.
Yeah, they would. Unless there were additional cuff checklists written for different landing sites.
Yes, the Apollo 16 astronauts had procedures for off-nominal landings and potential alternate missions included in their comprehensive flight data file, which encompassed the cuff checklists. So they did have cuff checklists prepared for alternate sites in case they didn't land where they were intending to land.
That would have mean they would have had to practice for all the different locations that they were going to be on.
That's right.
The lunar surface at Flagstaff.
Well, they could do it at Flagstaff, because they could lay it out in advance.
For every different location. We don't see them doing that. We only see them doing for the location that they actually landed on. Don't forget, they had to blow craters into the ground to create this at Flagstaff. Like, I've never seen anything as nonsensical as what you just said. But here, once again, if they had alternates, it's going to have the exact time it takes to get from one place to the other when they actually started that EVA, right to the minute. It's not possible. When they started the EVA, they started at timeline at 0. But when they started it, it's also included in the ground elapsed time, right?
Okay, yeah, it confirmed it. They did.
Where are these other checklists?
So now we look at ChatGPT and it says, yes, Apollo 16 had alternate cuff checklists prepared for contingency landing sites. Well, we're not going into that. We already know how it works. They do everything ahead of time, and then when they get there, they just flip the lists, and everything's there already, and they knew this magically because they were never there in the first place.
Right, but how do they know exactly what timeline to put on the cuff checklist?
Oh, look at this. There was alternative landing site procedures, alternative EVA geology plan, contingency surface checklists, and it says cuff checklists were modular, often inserted with Velcro, so alternate pages could be swapped in if needed.
So where are they?
Where are they?
Yeah, they should exist.
Yeah.
They're historical documents.
So ask ChatGPT which museums hold all of these and have them on display. Because anything that was flown has been available for auction or anything else, right? Anything on that craft that was flown. One of the astronauts took a roll of quarters and he's selling the quarters off because they were on the moon. So these things, if they were flown to the moon, would be a historical item that would be available.
They should have carried every single one of those checklists because they didn't know where they were going to land.
This is what it says. It says the alternative Apollo Cuff checklists for Apollo 16 are kept at the NASA Johnson Space Center JSC archives. This binder contains primary landing site checklists, alternative landing procedure sections, and contingency EVA plans. Well, we've never seen them. I've never seen these guys.
I've never seen anything about them. Another beautiful story.